Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third Human Rights in Practice event of the spring semester, Food Insecurity, Climate Change, and Human Rights. The Duke Human Rights in Practice series is organized by the Center for International Comparative Law and the International Human Rights Clinic. And many thanks to our co-sponsors today, of which there are several: the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Center at the Kenan Institute for Ethics, and 4 student-led groups: the Duke Environmental Law Society, the Duke Food Law Society, the Human Rights Law Society, and the International Law Society. So thank you again to all of our co-sponsors. A note also that today's session is being recorded and that we'll leave time at the end for Q&A. And please feel free to submit your questions throughout the course of the talk as they occur to you. And I will read out from the questions that you submit towards the end of our session. Please also feel free to use the Q&A function if you run into any tech issues, and we'll be able to respond to them there as well. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce our 2 speakers, and our huge thanks to both of them for joining us. We'll hear first from Tina Huang, who is a research analyst in the climate program at the World Resource Institute, WRI, where she supports Climate Watch data analysis and updates, outreach and engagement, and conducts research. Prior to joining the climate program at WRI, Tina interned with the organization's data team to support geospatial data processing, visualization, and analysis. And prior to that, she interned at WRI Beijing in the Sustainable Cities program, serving as research assistant at Data Driven Lab based at Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. We'll next hear from Kurt Josem, the Regional Vice President for the East Africa region of IRC, the International Rescue Committee. And Kurt is based in Nairobi, Kenya, so special thanks to joining us when it's his evening. The region covers Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, Uganda, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. Kurt has been with the IRC for 24 years and was previously Deputy Regional Director for the Horn and East Africa. Over the years, he's been Country Director for Uganda, East Timor, and Georgia, and has also held positions in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Tina, who'll be speaking first.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me just try to share my screen right now. All right, Aya, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So hi everyone, my name is Tina Huang. I'm a research analyst at the World Resources Institute. We are an environmental nonprofit organization and a global think tank that works on a mission to move the society to live in a way to protect the environment and its capacity to provide for the current and future generation. This sounds quite grand, but specifically we will work on areas like climate, energy, food, forest, water, sustainable cities, and ocean to move the needle towards a more sustainable future. Open data plays an essential role to inform sound policies and decisions. That's why at WRI, we have a number of open data platforms that focus on different topics, such as the Global Forest Watch that shows data on deforestation, or Climate Watch that focus on data from emissions and climate commitments. Today, I'm here to share some insights from a blog that I wrote while I was working on this open geospatial data platform called Resource Watch. Resource Watch provides trusted and timely geospatial data for decision-making. The platform holds about 300 data sets, including 51 near real-time data sets. Near real-time means that the data set is pulling the data directly from the source, which allows for as frequent as a daily update of the data. The beginning of last year, I was working on a data team for Resource Watch, and I started to read news about this developing locust swarm situation. I went back to Resource Watch and discovered that by overlaying different geospatial data sets, you can actually uncover insights as to which countries are vulnerable and what associated threats are for those countries. So also as a disclaimer upfront, the blog I was writing used the best open geospatial data available at that time, and there is better data and more disaggregated data made available afterwards, and I will share some of those with you today. Also, I'm a researcher based in Washington, D.C. Though our colleagues based in Africa office has also provided insights, most of the insights relied on desktop research and open data. However, I hope that I can convince you by the end of this talk that there are insights to uncover from easily accessible and open geospatial data that has at least helped me to understand one pieces of the situation. I want to start with the basics first. So what is a locust? You can think of it as a special kind of grasshopper. So each of them is about the size of a paperclip. Usually when there is a lot of rainfall and moisture, they reproduce really fast and increase dramatically in numbers. The reason we worry about those swarms is because they eat a lot of crops and they're not picky about what kind of crops they're eating. A swarm covering 1 square kilometer can eat as much in a day as 35,000 people. This is especially problematic in countries already suffering from hunger and food insecurity. On top of that, this is happening along with climate shocks and conflicts in some region, and of course, COVID-19 that have in the beginning hampered preparation effort to fight and control the pests. I also think that Kurt will speak more about the human rights implication and how some population are more impacted than the other. Next, I want to give you an update of the situation. From the UN FAO's Locust Watch latest update, the threat is not over. The good news is that the control operation continued in Ethiopia and Kenya against the swarm that is still immature. Good progress has been achieved, but as you can see in this map, swarms are still present and moving in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Saudi Arabia. For those of you who are more into the data side of things, the FAO's Locust Data Explorer here provides the latest data on swarm situation as well as control operations. In late 2020, Cyclone Ganti brought heavy rains, creating the condition for new swarms to form in eastern Ethiopia and central Somalia. FAO anticipates a new generation will emerge in early April this year, so next month, coinciding with seasonal rains and the planting season in Kenya and southern Ethiopia. Here I'm showing you the tropical cyclone dataset on Resource Watch. You can see that near East Africa, and there's this Cyclone Ganti that happened late December 2020. And this dataset is being updated daily on Resource Watch right now. The soil moisture viewer is the locust early warning system operated by the FAO. Soil moisture is a very good indicator of desert locust reproduction potential because the locust female will select the more moist and sandy area to lay their eggs, so they will hatch and not dry out. I won't really go into the weeds of this tool today, but it uses satellite images and remote sensing to show soil moisture in locust breeding areas. What makes the situation dire, though, is that locust swarm is happening in areas where food insecurity has already been an issue. I will start with the situation in East Africa countries. The Famine Early Warning System Network classify acute food insecurity based on a combination of different indicators related to food consumption, livelihood, and malnutrition. The data here shows that regions that are affected by locust swarm are already experiencing stress, crisis, or emergency level of food insecurity. The 3 countries that have been hotspots of locust activity, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia, these 3 countries are also experiencing high level of food insecurity to the tune of more than 10 million people collectively. If we take a look at the Global Hunger Index, which capture the multidimensional nature of hunger by calculating the hunger scores comprised of 4 indicators, so undernourishment, child wasting, child stunting, and child mortality. Ethiopia and Kenya are also experiencing serious level of hunger. Now let's take a look at the food price spike data. Food spikes add Local markets are often correlated with food insecurity crisis. Price spike can also have devastating impacts on rural households in developing countries because these households spend a large percentage of their income on food. If food supply further decrease because of locust swarm, it could exacerbate food insecurity. Here, I'm showing the latest data from World Food Program that indicates alerting levels and cases of food price spike in regions affected by locust swarm. Those are the red and yellow dots. So if you click on the data on Resource Watch, a box will pop up with all the details in terms of what kind of food at which market is experiencing a price spike. Now, if we take a look at the situation in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia right here is better positioned with a lower risk score for the global hunger index. But if we zoom in into Yemen, here I'm showing the latest famine early warning data predicting food insecurity for early this year. The countries with fewer resources and experiencing conflict, including like Yemen, didn't really go after the bugs as aggressively, and the war makes control efforts much more difficult. The 2020 Global Report on Food Crisis suggests that Yemen will likely experience the world's worst food crisis due to a combined effects of conflict, economic crisis, climate-related shocks, pests, including the desert locust. I just took a look at the latest locust activity from FAO's Locust Data Explorer. It seems like currently there are not a lot of swarms forming in Yemen, but things could develop if met with more rainfall. So while I was doing the research and reading more of the latest news this past weekend, one word really stick out to me is how unusual the locust swarm situation have been comparing to the past. I'm not here to say that 100% that climate change is playing a huge role here and things will definitely get worse over the next years to come. To what extent and how climate change is affecting locust swarm formation requires a lot of further studies, but I can share some of the latest science here. So this is a situation that could have become more common in a warmer world. East Africa's high number of cyclones and unusually wet weather have been driven by a positive phase of Indian Ocean dipole, dragging warmer than normal water towards the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. The dipole affects weather on both sides of the ocean, so from East Africa and Arabian Peninsula to Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. It's a bit of science here. I'm trying to break it down to simple terms. The Indian Ocean dipole was in the positive phase in the June to December period of both 2018 and 2019. In 2019, the dipole reaches most extreme positive level in 40 years. This drives more rainfall, as you can see illustrated in the red areas near the Horn of Africa region in this graph, and also play a role in driving Australia's bushfire in 2019 and early 2020, if we all still remember that, given the reduced chance of rain. A new study in Nature found that positive dipole effects are becoming more frequent. So climate change could lead to a faster warming in Western Indian Ocean and more frequent or stronger cyclone in East Africa, creating a favorable breeding ground for the locusts. Without effective preventative and control measures, locust outbreak could have become a more common occurrence. The last I want to say here is that the situation is developing so fast, and I hope this takeaway point stick with you, is that locust swarm is not a single issue. It becomes more complicated with climate shocks, conflicts, and existing food insecurity issue in the region. The good news is that we're in a better place right now than we were last year when the large-scale invasion was started. But this also doesn't mean that we can sit back and relax right now. The FAO said that 80 million is still needed to sustain the control operation. While you can keep monitoring the situation from FAO's Locust Watch after this talk, I also really encourage you to take a look at the current disaster events dataset, which updates very frequently on Resource Watch. I'm including an example for Yemen right now. The data comes from Relief Web, which shows what each country is experiencing in terms of disaster events. I focused on the greater Horn of Africa today, but there are also cases in Southwest Asian countries like India and Pakistan last year. All right, thank you very much. This concludes my part of the presentation. I'm very excited to hear more insights from Kurt's presentation as well in terms of what is going on the ground and what kind of implications are there for human rights. I'm including my contact info here in case you have more questions after the panel. And I'll now pass back to Aya.
Great, thank you so much, Tina. It was incredibly interesting, and the up-to-date data was very good to hear. And thank you also for explaining it in a way that's accessible for us who are not scientists. Just a quick note, I know this was included in the last slide, but for those who don't know, the FAO, which Tina referenced several times, is an agency in the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization, that focuses on issues around food security and nutrition, in case that comes up again. And I do see a couple of questions that have come up in the Q&A, so thank you for those, and we'll definitely turn to them following Kurt's presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Kurt.
Thank you, Aya, and thanks, Tina. That was absolutely fantastic. And I think we have quite a bit of overlap. In fact, one of our maps is the same map. Fantastic. Again, thank you, Aya. Thanks for having me here, and greetings to everyone from Kenya. I do want to reiterate how important data is for all of us on the ground, because in essence, it gives us the ability to provide context. It gives us proof of what we're doing being a success, or conversely, to look at the actions necessary to correct those errors that we're making. It allows us to advocate for funding. It allows us to advocate for policy change. And so data is extremely important, and hopefully I will throw a few data your way, although Tina has covered some really, really excellent points. So thanks, Tina. Balfour, please, next slide. I just want to give a little bit of overview about IRC, just so you know the perspective that I'm coming from. You may or may not know, but IRC was founded in 1933 at the behest of Albert Einstein, basically to help those persecuted in Europe to resettle in the US. In fact, resettlement is still a large part of our portfolio. And you can see in the US, we have about 18 offices that are responsible for resettling refugees. My part is the international aid side of it, and that was roughly started around the 70s. And what we do is we support people who have been impacted by conflict largely. And so whether that is displaced populations, whether it is people in the midst of conflict itself, whether it is people returning back to their homes from conflict, that's sort of where we find our niche. Our mission is to help people whose lives and livelihoods are shattered by conflict and disaster, including the climate crisis, to survive, recover, and gain control of their future. And I have to say that climate crisis actually was just added in our recent iteration of our strategy, recognizing the interconnectedness of conflict and climate. As I mentioned, my portfolio is 8 countries in the region. If you take a look at Africa there, I have Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and Somalia, and also Zimbabwe and Yemen. So it's nice to see Tina give Yemen a shout out, because clearly that's one of the most difficult places to operate. Collectively, our portfolio is about $150 million, broken down from grants from the US government, European governments, UN, and foundations. And we have about 4,000 staff that work in the region. What we do is we have what we call outcomes, and that's health, safety, education, economic well-being, and power. But what does this actually mean? Practically, we're talking about we do primary healthcare. We run hospitals and refugee camps, or clinics in rural areas, or mobile health teams in remote areas. We do nutrition. We provide supplementary food for malnourished children. We have a large sexual and reproductive health program supporting women to be able to access maternal child health care. We do environmental health, so water, sanitation, elaborate water systems, constructing toilets, promoting good hygiene practices. We have a women's protection empowerment program. We support survivors of sexual violence through clinical and social services, as well as support to women's groups. We do education, both formal and non-formal, largely specific to refugee populations, and we do child protection centers as well, which could be any constituent. And then finally, we have a large economic recovery programming. So we do skills training, apprenticeship, agriculture, and cash. And in fact, cash is between 20 and 25% of our entire portfolio worldwide. What I would like to talk about today, I hope it dovetails with what Tina has, is basically to give you a picture of East Africa. Desert locust features as well, but I'm also going to focus on other things like conflict and displacement, general climate change, food security as it is, and then COVID-19 and the impact that actually has on food insecurity all around. And then I will try and circle back to human rights, which I would find interested to hear some experts on this call, given that human rights instruments. Well, I want to look at the systems in place that may or may not address the issues. I'm going to paint a fragile picture of East Africa, but I do have to say, especially living here for over 15 years, East Africa is truly an amazing place. Lots of opportunities, the people are wonderful, and so I don't want to give the false impression that it's all crisis all the time, but I did want to just give a few facts. Next slide, please. So the first one, I'm starting out with conflict and displacement. And what this map, it provides a stark reality of the upheaval that states themselves are going through, or that they border states that are going through upheaval. We have civil and military conflict in Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. We have electoral violence in Burundi, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Uganda. And we have intercommunal violence in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. And you can see, I don't know if this is large enough, but the individual dots, the black dots are actual battles, and the red dots are attacks on civilians. So you can see that this from January 2020 until just earlier this month shows the frequency of these events. What this has resulted in is 14.3 million displaced populations in the region, of which 4.7 are refugees. And refugees, I think, as people know, are those that seek asylum across state borders and are governed by international refugee law. Many of these countries, ironically, actually are both refugee generating and refugee hosting countries, which is a little bit of a disparity there. The number of refugees, though, is only half of the number of internally displaced people within countries themselves, and they are not accorded the international protections that refugees have through the various legal instruments. So oftentimes find much more difficulty, or find themselves in a much more difficult place. And we have 9.6 million within the region, and new forced displacements are happening weekly due to ongoing conflicts. If you look at poverty indicators, and I don't have the information here, but generally they are quite high, and only Kenya is considered a lower middle income country, and that was only established within the last couple of years. Sudan and South Sudan are in the midst of extremely fragile government transitions. Sudan has with the overthrow of Bashir, has a amalgamation of the civilian population as well as the military, which is quite fragile right now. South Sudan is, after years of fighting and breaking away from Northern Sudan, has had issues amongst themselves, and now there's a unity government between the opposition and the government forces, and that's tenuous as well because it depends on satisfactory completion of several criteria, of which many have not been completed, such as cantonment of armies, etc. So it's still quite fragile. Uganda just came through elections, and they were the most violent elections in decades in Uganda. Tanzania also is in the aftermath of disputed elections. Djibouti has elections upcoming. Somalia has actually, they were supposed to have elections last month, but there was infighting amongst the various states within Somalia itself. There wasn't agreement how to do it. And so it's been deferred, except for the fact that the issue is the president remains in power, although his legitimacy is in question because actually his term in office has completed. So there's question marks there. And of course, Al-Shabaab is always a factor during this time. And then Ethiopia, they recently delayed their elections to June 5th. And that was one of the reasons behind Tigray exploding, because the Tigrayans decided to go ahead, felt that it was unconstitutional that the federal government was to delay the elections. And they went through with the elections and felt that the government in Addis was illegitimate. And so that was one of the drivers of the conflict. Next slide, please, Bafar. Shifting over to climate change. Tina has actually gotten, I think, into quite a few details and explained the change of broadly the climate, what's going on in the region, and abnormal patterns are becoming the norm, and overall temperatures have been steadily rising. This map here shows floods from June of last year only, and the number of displaced population that from that through the region. And you total all this together, it's about 4 million people displaced, and not to mention wiping out their crops and other livelihoods. Obviously, flooding is becoming more of an issue because of the substantial quantity of rainfall, the frequency, and the denuding of natural foliage. On the flip side, and Tina covered part of this as well, is drought. And drought is also increasing in frequency. I actually think Tina's right, is that we shouldn't necessarily say climate change definitively results in it, but by strong indications are that it does contribute to drought. The higher temperatures in the region, it increase or means there's greater evaporation, soil moisture is reduced, reinforces drier conditions, and it intensifies the impact of failed rains. So crops and pastures have less water, and the chance of failed harvests or lack of feed for livestock increases. So that's definitely evident. Case in point, I think, is Somalia. And Somalia used to have a drought roughly every 10 years or so, more or less. One of the most severe was 10 years ago, where 250,000 people died. And the next drought that we can remember that we responded to was in 2014 and 2015. And it's been basically every 2 years since then. And Somalia is now facing pre-drought conditions. So obviously the impact that has is that the interchange and severity of extreme weather doesn't allow for those that have been impacted or affected by one of the hazards to recover in time for the next one. And that's one of the biggest issues, that people just cannot gain the upper hand. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put and this is just looking at the next couple of months. And you know, the great thing is there is a lot of data out there, and so there is the possibility to prepare. And what this shows is just that the rainfall on the left and the temperature on the right, you see that the warmer than normal temperatures are going to hit Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Western South Sudan. And that's going to lead to drier conditions, water scarcity, and likely crop failure, unless something is done. Conversely, you see the countries in the southern part, the Tanzania, Uganda, southern South Sudan, southern Ethiopia, and there's going to be cooler than average temperatures, and that will And if you compare that to the one on the left, that actually will, you see higher rainfalls expected in those areas as well, which will lead to floods, mudslides, pests, and diseases. Next slide, please. Now, you've seen this map before. So I'm actually not going to go into the desert locusts as much because Tina did a great job. I think the one thing I did want to flag is the economic impact. And so just last year in Kenya and Ethiopia, 67% of crop and pasture was lost because of desert locusts, and which is a significant amount in countries that rely on agriculture. Now, the last large locust outbreak was in 2003 and was between 2003 and 2005 in the region. And that resulted in approximately $2.5 billion in crop damage. And in all likelihood, in spite of, I think, the FAO and other, all the partners involved, and there are many partners that are addressing this, I think that the 2.5 billion will be exceeded this time around. And interesting enough, there's actually a desert locust collaboration meeting tomorrow. So if this had been tomorrow, then I could have given the latest information. Next slide, please, Buffalo. So what does this result? It results in food insecurity. And you know, when you bring in all these factors together, the conflict, the climactic shocks, the desert locust, etc., there is a huge swath, and I will talk about what IPC means, if just to have the colors explained. But this means 31 million people in total are considered food insecure in the region. Ethiopia has the largest amount of 13 million, and they are facing the gamut of climactic shocks, conflict, desert locusts. And so that's a huge concern. Sudan, you look at Sudan and it's almost entirely in stressed or crisis phase. And because they are undergoing an economic crisis with hyperinflation, they have conflict and they have last year's floods, they are having a difficult time addressing that. Somalia, as you can see, they're facing pre-drought conditions, and you see the sort of reddish on there, which indicates that it's anticipated that, or there's a huge potential of famine to be likely in the near future. And with the complex political situation, the conflict dynamics, it is, I think, and obviously the pre-drought conditions, that they will have a tough time to recover from that. And the most concerning in my mind is South Sudan. And in South Sudan, as you see, there's already famine that's declared there. And of most concern is the fact that actually hunger season hasn't even hit South Sudan yet. Generally, it actually starts in April. And so when we're moving in that direction, the future doesn't bode well. Next, please. So this is sort of IPC, the integrated phase classification, explained a bit with a listing out of the country. So it's a different, it's the same thing that you just saw on the map, on the previous map, but puts the stark numbers out there. So just a little bit about the integrated phase classification. So it's a scale that's used to determine the severity of food insecurity for a certain target population. And there's a standard set of indicators. There's a whole variety, but it includes food consumption, numbers of malnourished children, and death rates, amongst others. And so that the humanitarian community can take a look at this and see the severity, and then try to prevent the populations from moving down the IPC scale. Now, one thing about South Sudan is you see that there's currently, there's 105,000 that are currently in famine conditions. But you look at the total amount of 5.768 that are crisis and above. And that's actually 52% of the entire population of South Sudan. South Sudan has 11 million people. And if you add those that are in stressed, That's over 9 million out of 11 million people who are already food insecure. And that's why it is an extremely concerning situation. Now, one caveat about IPC that I think people should be aware of is that while it was developed as an objective data-driven approach to determining food insecurity, there are some things that hamper it. Number one is there's a lack of information at times. So you cannot declare, or you cannot actually gather this information without identifying or without access to populations to get the information necessary for those standards. And for example, Yemen is an example, is that the Houthis in the north generally don't allow information to be sent out that would actually classify this. And so we always say that it's famine-like conditions, but we can't necessarily declare famine because we don't have the information. Similarly, in Tigray, up in northern Ethiopia, we don't have access largely due to insecurity, but also from the federal government not allowing access to populations to be able to categorize this as famine. But you hear there's anecdotal information that starvation is happening. And so that's a problem. And then the second issue, besides lack of information, is it is quite political, and governments do not want to be seen as failing their citizens or failing in their charge, and so often won't or will conceal information or downplay information, and so that becomes an issue. And one of the things that that comes up for humanitarian aid organizations in a political environment is, and I'm going to quote Alex de Waal if people know who he is. He works at the Fletcher School. And basically he says, when the cause of mass starvation is military policy, because sometimes it is a policy that governments do use, or non-governments, militia use, humanitarian agencies face a terrible dilemma. Will they denounce the abuses and risk getting thrown out of the country, or will they stay silent and become complicit in starvation crimes? And that's one of the most difficult situations to deal with. But it goes without saying that if a famine is declared, it's already too late because there are already deaths that are happening. In fact, there's deaths in emergency and crisis as well. It just is slower and fewer in number. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, we need to mention the COVID, given how that is impacting everything and everywhere. What I've put on a couple of maps here, just looking at the numbers, but also looking at kind of the border closings. Now, initially, governments in East Africa did quite well. Several of them clamped down early, closed not just borders, but internal borders. I couldn't leave where I'm here. In the county for several months because it was that tight. But numbers are continuing to grow, and the number that you see here actually this is an old report. I think it's December. So the actual number right now is about 375,000 confirmed cases and about 7,500 deaths. Still not as severe as other parts of the world, but given that health facilities are not necessarily available or of high standard, it is obviously a concern. What's equally a concern is the impact on the economy that's happened. And so on the map to the right shows the border closures. And what that did is that affected the flow of goods and services between countries, which is a huge source of income for many. And then tourism and export also have been canceled as well. 90% of urban poor in Nairobi, in Kampala, in Addis, basically live hand to mouth. And so when the lockdowns happened and people couldn't actually go out and earn that daily wage, that had a devastating impact as well. And then finally, with regard to the economic side of it, is that a lot of people rely on remittances, and remittances for all of Africa dipped 21% last year, which is a huge amount. Many schools were closed during the duration. Here in Kenya, they closed it from March and they just reopened in January, meaning a lot of the kids have to actually repeat a year. And then politically, COVID has been used to, as I said, delay elections in several countries, but also to physically put down election rallies or decline election rallies, which has then caused even more fervor. Okay, next slide, please. And I'm almost done. This is basically, it's a consolidation of all the maps. And the first one is an overlay of the food insecurity as well as the locust affected areas. The middle one looks at floods and disease outbreaks, and I didn't even touch on disease. And then the third one shows the same conflict and displacement that we had. And so just to sort of wrap up the numbers, 31.5 million severely food insecure people in the region. The number of IDPs has increased to 9.7. Refugees is 4.6 million. The flood affected people is 4 million now. And then the COVID cases is about 375,000. And so you can see the gravity of the situation. So what does this have to do with human rights? That's the question. And I think there are obviously several human rights that we could bring up in violation of human rights. And it would be great to actually hear some of the experts involved, to see what their impression. We could talk about the right to life, the right to personal security, the right to equality and freedom from discrimination, or we could talk about the right to food. So there's so much that could be done, but I think what's important is to talk about why there's, I think, a failure of addressing this. Because when you look at it, each hazard in its own right doesn't result in food insecurity. Each of them separately are devastating, absolutely, but lack of food is not what causes a famine. It doesn't matter if it's disease, it's climate or conflict, but food security is a result of how we respond to these adverse events. And by we, I largely mean governments. Now, if we look at the national government, the national level, and I'm painting a broad picture here, so I can go specific into countries, but just broadly. So it's the government's responsibility to its own constituency. And generally, the states in the region are unable or unwilling to put together an adequate response to shocks. Or even mitigation measures, because knowing that these shocks are going to happen is that we should be able to do disaster risk reduction. There should be plans in place to be able to mitigate this, but largely there's not. This is largely a result of weak constitutions or failure to adhere to constitutions, or the failure of democratic institutions, and it results in a dysfunctional governance structures. So if the state fails, then it should be kicked up to the regional level. And here in East Africa, there are several regional systems. We have the East African Community, we have the Intergovernmental Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, and we have the African Union, and all are viable structures in place to be able to deal with their member states. There's mixed results when they get involved, however. Generally the response is slow because there's a lot of diplomacy that has to happen, a lot of sovereignty issues that have to be overcome before any sort of humanitarian intervention kicks in. It takes a long time, and when they do intervene, oftentimes it's politicized, and the political processes result in delays or inadequacy of an intervention. And so where does that leave the international system? Balfour, you can change the, I guess that's 2 words, so there you go. So the next level up is the international system. And the UN is the backbone of humanitarian support in the region, absolutely. But the UN is also very political in nature. And it's also subject to the whims of geopolitics and political influence. So the UN system will address the humanitarian issue at hand. So WFP will distribute food for food insecurity. So there is those interventions and those targeted interventions, but rarely are the root causes of problems addressed, and that's the issue. I wish I had an easy answer to rectify this. I don't. I'm hoping that many of you will. But there's a saying among aid workers that goes, humanitarian crises don't have humanitarian solutions, but what's needed is high-level political action, and that's definitely what's needed. Last slide, Balfour. Basically, this is just a quote, and I think I know that you're never supposed to have this much text on a slide, but I throw it up there anyways, and you can read it as I talk. But this came from the International Crisis Group's 10 conflicts to watch in 2021, and it's the first time they actually put climate change as one of the conflicts to watch in 2021 because of the impact that it has in multiple arenas, and it's just something I think that bears in mind, because conflict and climate are so interlaced. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kurt. That was also really incredible and helpful to link together all of these really underlying causes. That what we have before us is the desert locust disaster, but how that ties to climate change and development and human rights and rule of law. We do have a couple of questions. I might just add, building on what you ended with in terms of human rights, I might just add a couple points to that. So, really agreeing in terms of the huge range of human rights that are so impacted by, again, the desert locust situation now, but climate change more broadly. So as you really identified, everything ranging from more economic, social, cultural rights, like access to food, water, housing, employment, education, and also sort of, what we see as in some ways the most fundamental right of the right to life when you're facing food insecurity issues. And then, with the migration that this can also cause, irregular migration routes and all of the risks that carry, including the risk of trafficking in persons for many people as they embark, searching for other places where they can build a new home and find land where they can, have their crops. And then the second point also, again, as you said, the failure to really address more root causes, and the fact that under international human rights law, governments have an obligation not only to provide remedies and reparations once a human rights violation has occurred, but also to take steps to ensure that they don't happen in the first place. And that, as you said, must address underlying poverty and discrimination and issues around rule of law. And so highlighting that those preventative measures are really a core component of the human rights obligation. And just finally, I was really struck in the report that IRC put out on this double burden of locusts and COVID-19, the discriminatory or disproportionate impact of the locusts on women and girls, especially as their male partners or their sons have to basically, go to other places because they're not able to use the land where they are because of crop failure. And so women and girls facing increasing security risks as male members of their families and communities leave, and also then carrying the burden of running their small enterprises or farming in their communities while also continuing to do the unpaid care work that tends to fall on women as well. And so again, that human rights obligates governments to address those who are most impacted, including the most marginalized members of society, which in this case includes women and children, and I'm sure also many other subgroups that are even more impacted by the locust outbreak. So with that, I will turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. And the first question, which maybe I'll broaden a little bit, is whether or not there's a correlation between food insecurity and the status of a country as an ally of the US. And I can perhaps broaden that. You referenced different geopolitical dynamics that impact the role that the UN plays, but similarly in the context of relationships between countries. So again, a correlation between food insecurity and status as an ally of the US or broader geopolitical issues. And then I'll ask two questions at once. The second, this was following your presentation, Tina, asking whether it's correct that there is a reduced chance of rain in Sumatra, Java, Borneo, as well as Australia. So if we can start with those two questions, please.
Sure. I'll go first. I mean, it's a great question, and the U.S. wields so much influence in the world in general, and in the aid industry. And it's interesting, the stark contrast between the previous presidential administration and the current administration actually is something that plays a role. For example, you have, I'll use Yemen as an example. In spite of all of the indicators of almost famine in Yemen and everything that the Yemeni are going through, the U.S. government was still trying to be punitive on the Houthis because of their alliance to Iran. Which basically means that they were looking at suspending aid. They're looking at designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization, which in essence would mean that it would cripple the humanitarian response in Yemen, because you couldn't use anything affiliated with the ruling parties in the north, which would be the bank. So you couldn't make bank transfers, importation of things, etc. Whereas actually, when Biden came in, they ended up rescinding that immediately, because I think they recognized the repercussions that would have on it. So that's, for example, Yemen. I can use Ethiopia as a good example. Ethiopia has been stable for decades, and it is seen as nobody wants an unstable Ethiopia, because it is an ally against terrorism around the region. It is one of the main forces in the region, so it actually supports troops in Somalia, say, and other places. And so Ethiopia's actually been the darling of the West, not just the US, but the West for the last couple of decades. But there have been severe human rights violations from the ruling party, which actually was the TPLF at the time. And so, because it was a national interest for stability there, that often things were overlooked. And then just the third one, and Tina, then I'll hand over to you, is South Sudan. The US has been a champion of South Sudan since they gained independence in 2011. In fact, they were one of the main sponsors of South Sudan, but interest has waned over the years, and with the interest waning, so has support financially, and that has as you see now, that has had detrimental impact on the populations there.
Yeah, and on the second question on the reduced rainfall, so the scientists, I think we're always very cautious to say something like, oh, this will definitely 100% will happen. But we know that if we're seeing more positive Indian Ocean dipole events, that the chance for reduced rainfall on the other side of the ocean near Indonesia and Australia will become more likely. And on the next side of the greater Horn of Africa, I'm also reading papers on examining the past cyclone events and their intensity data, and we're seeing more frequent and more intense rounds of cyclones and rainfalls as well.
Thank you both. A couple more questions. Another question is whether there is data so in terms of the help that is being, or assistance being provided to countries in need, is there data to support that those nations that actually need help the most are receiving it in a way that's consistent and or sustainable? And there was a second question about elaborating on the impact of the Ethiopian elections. I know, Kurt, you just highlighted Ethiopia, so if there's anything you want to add in terms of the elections. And then there was a question that came up about how the IPC scale works, which I think was sent immediately before, Kurt, you elaborated on that. So you might have actually responded in your presentation, but if there's anything you'd want to add around that. So those three, the assistance, Ethiopian elections, and anything more on the IPC.
Tina, you want to go first, or you want me to take a crack at them?
Yeah, if you want to start.
Okay, so I think you know, it's interesting because what happens is the sexy aid situations get more attention from donors or advocates, etc. And so Yemen is in the news, and it's in the news a lot. And so it is one of those countries that actually has a lot of money pouring its way. Now it's not enough, and there was a recent pledging conference which didn't meet the entire needs, but comparatively to other areas in the world, it gets a lot more attention and a lot more funding. South Sudan, who I referenced before, is probably in the need the most, and there's either donor fatigue and others aren't necessarily interested in spite of the data presented. And it's one of those things that what it depends on is, you know, we can actually present the data, which we try to do and try to get attention on it. But if it's not in the strategic if it's not a strategic issue for the country itself, it won't necessarily make the top 10, even though the data would say it should. For the Ethiopia elections, so the concerning thing about that is Ethiopia is set up in all of their states are fairly homogenous with the populations there. And so Tigray, I think, is only the start of what is likely to be a situation where the country cracks. And there's already in an area called Benishagul, Gumuz, there's already been daily conflict there of different ethnic groups killing others, and that's causing people to to move as well. And with the election and the election being delayed, another ethnic group has already said that they're not going to recognize that election. And so I firmly believe that, okay, Tigray is special because they were in power for many, many years, and there is some vindication, for them, which contributes to the atrocities that are going on there. But for the rest of it, I think it's a very fragile situation, and I'm for one, I'm worried that that is going to be a downward spiral, and the election itself is going to be a trigger for that.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to add to that. So in addition to those funding allocated to respond to a crisis that is already happening, it's really important for the government to incorporate climate change in the planning themselves. So to build up immediate and long-term infrastructure to address food insecurity more proactively and more systematically, and to build resilience in the food system. I'm so glad that Kurt also mentioned how important the role of government is to fight in food insecurity and hunger issues are issues of access, distribution, and equality.
Great. Well, with that, we are at time. So again, huge thanks to Tina Huang from the World Resource Institute and Kurt Josim from IRC for the extremely informative and thoughtful presentations that you shared with us, and for all of you for joining and for the thoughtful questions that you submitted. See you next time.